Hopefully, we can all agree that the discussion on ITAR and EAR was a lengthy but necessary one. Here, of equal importance, we're going to move on to a discussion on sanctions and embargoes. A sanction being a specific measure that the U.S. and or its allies takes against a country, an individual person, a company or organization, and full-on trade or economic embargoes against a specific country. Section 30 represents a bit of a departure from what we saw in the previous many sections, but certainly no less important, and actually ties into discussions on BIS, on the DDTC, on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It all comes together in this discussion. Let's kick off with an introduction to sanctions and embargoes. In addition to its agency-specific export control activities, as we just spoke of, BIS, DDTC, etc., the U.S. government also participates in sanctions and embargoes programs. Sometimes those sanctions and embargoes are unilateral, the United States only, or they're multilateral. The U.S. participates with other countries. In either scenario, we're talking about trade and economic sanctions, specific measures taken, as well as embargoes. Sanctions are normally put in place for purposes of national security, keep the country safe and American citizens abroad safe, or in pursuit of U.S. foreign policy. As we've noted a couple of times now, we will repeat in our last bullet point here that sanctions can be against countries, organizations, entities, or individuals, actual people. To make a distinction with our first bullet point, we want to say that sanctions and embargoes can also be financial and or economic. Economic meaning trade-type sanctions, where financial sanctions are more banking-oriented. Starting with our second bullet point, we have a fairly exhaustive list of examples of economic and financial sanctions. Let's run through them. First, embargoes on the purchase or sale of goods and or services. Conducting trade with specific countries or sectors within a country. Industrial sectors within a country. Even individuals. Either the purchase or sale of goods and or services. Very traditional trade-related embargo. Second sub-bullet point, prohibitions on transacting business with nationals of a sanctioned or embargoed nation. And that's globally. So to say, in the older case of Cuba, it was actually, as part of the U.S. embargo on Cuba, a U.S. company, a U.S. person could not do business with a Cuban national, even if that Cuban was living in Madrid, Spain. That's what they're talking about here. Another example, second to the last sub-bullet point, airline and ocean carrier prohibitions. No flights to or from a country. No U.S. flag ships to or from a country. That's what we mean by airline and ocean carrier prohibitions. And of course, travel bans, where U.S. citizens cannot travel to a specific country, or people from that country cannot travel to the United States. Continuing on, and a more classic example is the freezing of assets. Dollar-denominated assets, especially in the U.S. banking system. So a country like in Iran that had its assets frozen by the United States for quite some time. Prohibitions on insurance transactions are another example. Any type of financial transaction with the sanctioned country or countries, wire transfers, things of that nature. A general exclusion from international banking relationships, whereby banks in a specific country and an embargoed country could not have a corresponding banking relationship with banks in the United States or certain of our allies overseas, Western Europe being a good example. So exclusion from the international banking system really puts a squeeze on embargoed countries, especially when that exclusion includes no access to what is referred to as CHIPS and SWIFT. These are electronic tools. CHIPS stands for Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System, how banks wire money to one another internationally. And then the SWIFT system, which we've actually talked about in Module 2, and we'll talk about again in our module on international payment mechanisms, but that stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, how banks talk to each other internationally. Embargoed countries typically get cut off from access to both CHIPS and SWIFT. Some others, not necessarily related to banking, but could involve banks, the exclusion from financial markets. equity markets, stock markets specifically, or debt or stock exchanges, commodities exchanges, stock markets, access to buying and selling of bonds, all of those things. Second sub-bullet point on this slide, the inability to use international financial instruments. This type of sanction is a little bit more visible to U.S. exporters because it involves things like letters of credit, site drafts, or time drafts. That's what we mean by a documentary credit or a documentary collection. So for a U.S. exporter to get a letter of credit over the years with Libya, very difficult, if not impossible. Same for North Korea. So no access to payment terms for the buying and selling of goods. And then a general exclusion from access to U.S. dollars. Cut off the embargoed country from access to U.S. dollars because the U.S. dollar is the de facto world currency. Lots of trading, for example, in oil, is denominated in U.S. dollars. So for a country to be excluded from access to USD really puts a squeeze on that particular country. So these are all examples of economic and or financial sanctions. Some further distinctions to be made here. Sanctions and embargoes can be unilateral or part of a multinational effort. We mentioned this briefly. So the United States, in the case of Cuba, as the prime example, can undertake sanctions and embargoes or be part of a multilateral effort, which is usually, sub-bullet point, in support of United Nations resolutions. We'll be talking more about that in just a bit. But the UN gets together and member states all agree, based on a UN resolution, to place sanctions and an embargo on a North Korea, as an example. So we want to be able to make that distinction. Is the U.S. acting alone, unilaterally, or is it part of a UN resolution, multinational, multilateral effort? As a trade tip, and we'll be breaking this down in further detail, but it's important to know that in the U.S., sanctions and embargoes are administered by multiple agencies, depending on the nature of the product or service that is going to be exported. We'll note that the Office of Foreign Assets Control has a great deal of activity as it relates to sanctions and embargoes, but that is not to say that OFAC runs things exclusively in the realm of sanctions and embargoes. That's not the case. BIS is involved, DDTC is involved, the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, all depends on the nature and use of products and services. We'll talk more about that later. But for certain, as a best practice, let's say that the integration of agency-specific licensing compliance with sanctions and embargoes requirements must be an essential part of any company's export compliance program. Quite the mouthful, but what we're really trying to say here is that all of the things we've talked about thus far, understanding ITAR, understanding the Export Administration regulations as it relates to our specific business, that's very important. But our compliance efforts, our compliance program cannot stop there. We have to be able to focus on countries, organizations, individuals against which sanctions and or embargoes have been put in place, be cognizant of those sanctions and embargoes, and make sure that knowledge of said sanctions and embargoes is spread throughout the entire organization, not only in the U.S., but worldwide as well. A quick reminder, and we saw this slide previously, but talking about Country Group E embargoed countries. At the time of recording this particular section, these are the countries that are in Country Group E, E1 and E2. You have terrorist supporting countries. Cuba was removed as a state sponsor of terror. That's why there's no X in their box. But as of right now, we're talking about Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria as terrorist supporting countries. And then a unilateral embargo, great example of that unilateral embargo we alluded to a couple of times now, against Cuba. Unilateral means in this instance only one country, and that's the United States. The embargo against Cuba is not a worldwide thing. It never was. It was always the U.S. unilaterally acting against Cuba. Actually, with the United Nations denouncing that unilateral embargo for many, many years. That was a quick introduction to sanctions and embargoes. We're going to stop here and pick up in our next section on what is entitled Multilateral Sanctions, more than one country, the U.S. support of United Nations resolutions. So we're starting to pick up some steam. Please come back as quick as you can.